Let's be clear about this video's context and purpose right from the get-go. Given the fact that it's no longer 2012, the focus of this video isn't to dunk on creationist flood arguments. Here, we're gonna try and figure out how Noah and life could actually survive a great flood, using any, and I mean any means. In other words, what would it actually take in terms of resources and manpower to save all of Earth's life from a world-ending flood? Let's give all of you who skipped Sunday school a recap on the Noah's Ark flood myth. It's pretty similar to all the other flood myths, you know, the ones where Zeus is sick of humans so sends a flood, or the one where the Mesopotamian god Enlil thinks people are too noisy so also sends a flood. Anyway, the Abrahamic god is also sick of humanity and decides to send a great flood to cleanse the planet of sin. God gives his pal Noah a heads up and gives him a recipe for a big boat, or you could say an ark, on which he and his family can endure the flood. But, says God, this ship isn't just for them. Noah is also to take mating pairs of every kind of animal in the world in order to repopulate it once the destruction has been waged. Now let's get into the fun part, logistics. This is a project beyond the scope of any that humanity has ever undertaken, so I will certainly end up glossing over some details, but I will do my best to paint you a broad picture. First of all, let's think about how many animals would need to be aboard the Ark. There is no easy answer to this question. Before we try to tally anything up, it's important to clarify that we can't leave any kind of life behind. Let me explain some more. The global flood mentioned in Genesis supposedly lasted for a period of 371 days. It rained so hard across the planet in just the first 40 days that the entire world flooded. This massive and sudden great flood would obviously cause all types of water of all pHs, temperatures, and salinities to mingle, which would be about as damaging to sea life as plunging a polar bear into the toasty Amazon River. So even though it's usually just land-dwelling creatures depicted as being boarded onto the Ark, it's vital that representatives from each type of fish, aquatic invertebrates, and marine mammals all be brought aboard the Ark as well. And of course, the animal kingdom couldn't survive without the producers and decomposers on the bottom of the food chain: plants, fungi, bacteria, archaea, and protozoa. If marine life couldn't survive the flood, you'd be hard-pressed to find rose bushes hardy enough to withstand a year's submersion, or, moreover, rose seeds. Many seeds and spores are rendered inviable after exposure to salt water, or some if you just look at them the wrong way. Even if the animals survived the voyage, they'd be coming back to a desolate planet barren of anything to eat. It is therefore vital that seeds, spores, grafts, or asexually reproducing representatives from the other kingdoms also be brought on board. And essentially, this means that specimens of every living organism have to be brought on board. Not only that, but according to certain schools of thought, Noah didn't just take the animals on the Ark who are alive today. He instead brought aboard examples of every single animal which has ever existed throughout the 3.5 billion year history of life on this planet. Scientists currently estimate there are about 8.7 million eukaryotic species roaming the Earth today, although only 1.2 million of those species have been formally described. It's further estimated that roughly 99% of all species which have ever existed are now extinct. So that means there have been approximately 5 billion species. And for our Ark, according to those certain schools of theological thought, we need them all. The how doesn't matter, let's just assume we get them. T-Rexes, titanosaurs, ancient tree-sized mushrooms, and all. Every species that has ever existed at any period in Earth's history. And this number increases by several orders of magnitude when we include all of the microbial species. About the same amount of bacterial species have yet to be discovered as are killed by hand sanitizer, 99.99%. Guesstimates say there are 1 trillion species of microbes squiggling in every crevice of the planet, and if we assume 99% of all bacterial and archaeal species have gone extinct, well, then the Ark would need to accommodate for around 100 trillion prokaryotic species. The numbers just defy comprehension, but comprehend we must. This is already more passengers than would fit in even a clown car, but we still need even more. In the Bible, God tells Noah to take a mating pair of each critter with him, but that would make each species inbred to the point of collapse within a few generations. The bare minimum number of individuals required to keep the species alive with a diverse enough gene pool is 50, but biologists recommend more like 150 for true genetic diversity, considering that many animals and plants have a unique array of parasitic flora and fauna within them that Noah must ensure make it through the flood alive. Even if that means letting their hosts die, we will take the larger recommended number of 150 individual animals of each species with us, and also 150 seeds or spores or grafts of all plants and fungus, while we will take a petri dish of each microbe, or else inoculate the microbes into their preferred host. In summary, we need space for roughly 5 billion eukaryotic species and 100 trillion prokaryotic species, which means we need space for 750 billion individual eukaryotic specimens, which is more than 7 times the number of Homo sapiens who have ever lived. And that's not even considering the 15 quadrillion individual prokaryotic specimens. That might sound like a lot at first glance, but 15 quadrillion is only about the number of cells that are in 500 grown men. But that is nowhere near the number of men who will be required to take care of the passengers. A random sampling of over 100 zoos from the 1980 International Zoo Yearbook showed a ratio of 25.4 animals per zoo staffer. Approximately 17% of all eukaryotic species are estimated to be animals. So this means there will be about 130 billion animals that will need attending to. So that means that just the animals will need approximately 5.1 billion workers. That's about the entire contemporary population of Asia and South America combined. Of course, fungal spores, seeds, and smears of E. coli do not require the same level of attention as animals. So to take care of all the non-animals, let's add only an extra 1 billion workers, throwing in the contemporary populations of Europe and the United States as well, for a total of 6.1 billion workers. That'll be around 378.2 billion kilograms of weight just in human caretakers. But before we get into the more complex requirements of feeding, watering, and managing the waste of all the passengers, let's talk about the living requirements of the staff. We will assume they all have the appetites of a somewhat small man, caloric requirements of 2,000 calories a day. This is conveniently pre-allocated into bottles of Soylent. 5 bottles of Soylent contain 2,000 calories, in addition to all the necessary daily vitamins and minerals. And according to the back of the bottle, it's not recommended to replace every meal with Soylent, but life on the Ark isn't supposed to be all fun and games. Diarrhea is just going to have to be a part of life while aboard the Ark. So, 5 bottles a day for 6.1 billion workers for 371 days amounts to just over 11.3 trillion bottles of Soylent, all of which will, of course, be the superior cocoa flavor. These bottles would be about 4.7 billion metric tons, or about 1/17 of the total biomass of Earth, a necessary sacrifice. 1 bottle of Soylent contains 20 grams of soy protein isolate, which is about the same amount of protein isolated from a 100-gram portion of soybeans. This means to produce enough Soylent for the crew of the Ark, Noah and co. will need to harvest and process 1.1 trillion kilograms of soybeans. The United States currently produces 4.31 billion bushels, or around 117 billion kilograms of soybeans per year. So it would only take the entire United States about 10 years to produce enough soybeans for the Soylent on the Ark. But how long would it take to manufacture that many bottles using that soy? Well, humanity purchases over 50 billion water bottles per year. If every single factory in the world that produces water bottles today switched to strictly Soylent production, it would take 228 years to produce all of it for the journey. And to drink, each worker will need 3 liters of water per day. Assuming the technology of Noah and co. is too rudimentary to figure out water filtration, i.e. my brain is too rudimentary to figure out how much water you can filter out of urine, this will amount to 6.8 trillion liters of water, which is, of course, 6.8 trillion kilograms of weight. This makes the total current weight of the cargo of the Ark 11.85 trillion kilograms, which is about the mass of all the gold in all the world's oceans. Now, we're going to pack all the workers in as tightly as possible on board the Ark because OSHA hasn't been invented yet. Thankfully, without any regulations, we could pack everyone in as tightly as they keep corpses in mortuaries, keeping everyone in coffin-sized bed pods amounting to 0.882 meters cubed per worker. This is a total of 5.4 billion meters cubed for the whole crew, which is 404.5 times the volume of the largest building ever created, Boeing's Everett factory in Washington state. but I think we can trim this number down by about 30% by, instead, hanging sleeping bags to the ceiling and having the whole crew sleep like a swarm of bats. To compensate for all the neck pain that this will inevitably cause, we will bring 10 extra crew members on as chiropractors and acupuncturists, about the same ratio of mental health care staff per student that a standard university has. This won't impact any of our calculations. So that's about all we need for the workers taking care of the cargo: food, water, sleeping chambers, and a couple of masseuses. But what about the needs of the cargo itself? Every animal has its own unique needs, but the broadest categories we can put them in are terrestrial and aquatic. It's pretty hard, actually, to get a precise estimate of how many species are in each of these categories, especially considering how NOAA has to get specimens from eras before the Cambrian, when the vast majority of life was still in the oceans. However, for simplicity, we will base our calculations on modern guesstimates. We are assuming that approximately 80% of animals are terrestrial, while 20% are marine animals. Let's start with the landlubbers. The average animal that many theologists use to describe the capacity of the ark with is the sheep. Around 70% of mammals are small rodents, bats, and shrews, and most amphibians and reptiles are in the realm of shrew-sized. So when we average the size of harvest mice with the size of mastodons, a sheep ends up seeming about right. So we'll stick with the sheep as the average animal, letting stick insects live in the lap of luxury. Now, of course, there are many types of feeding habits of the animals, but for relative simplicity, we will divide the animals broadly into the category of carnivore and herbivore. There will, presumably, be plenty of dead animals and/or staff members on board that scavengers can feed on eventually. Anyway, let's start with the straightforward estimate for the herbivores, basing their daily caloric needs on the sheep. An adult sheep needs a little more than 2 kilograms of hay per day. Of course, there are animals with very specific dietary needs. Koalas only eat eucalyptus, pandas only eat bamboo, my hamster won't eat perfectly good hamster pellets and only picks out the sunflower seeds. So, although for sheep and many other herbivores it'll be hay, just know that it means vegetable matter in general, mostly dry or otherwise preserved vegetable matter since, of course, refrigeration hadn't been invented yet at the time of Noah. Soylent and plastic bottles, sure. Refrigerators, nah. Since herbivores compose roughly 70% of animals, this will be a total of 76 trillion kilograms of food for the herbivores. But wait, carnivores mostly need fresh meat, sometimes supplemented by vegetable matter. Additionally, many carnivores refuse to eat pre-killed food, the same way many people refuse to eat conveniently pre-chewed food. So we will need to keep livestock on board for daily slaughter and processing. We will keep, of course, sheep and also crickets for the insectivores. And like all the other estimates, it's hard to get an estimate for how many insectivores there are in comparison to just pure carnivores. So we're just gonna guess about 30% of carnivores are insectivores. For the size of our average carnivore, we're using a sheep. I mean, a wolf in sheep's clothing who eats just over a kilogram per day of meat. Keep in mind, this will also count for food for big eaters like lions and allosauruses, in addition to tiny ferrets. And as our average insectivore, we will use a bearded dragon. He will, for consistency among the animal kingdom, be dressed in a sheep costume, and he will eat about 10 crickets per day. So to keep all of our carnivores fed for the duration of the flood, we will need 33 billion sheep. That's as many sheep as 21st century people would slaughter over the course of 60 years. And for the insectivores, we'd only need 30 trillion crickets. If you lined all of them up, they'd stretch between the Earth and the Sun 6 times. There. Now, the total amount of vegetable matter that we need to sustain both the sheep and crickets would be bumped up to 90 trillion kilograms, which would take the United States' hay production, as it currently is, 755 years. Noah was supposedly 600 years old at the time God spoke to him, so I think all this hay would be harvestable in the lifetime of our workers. Although how all of that hay would be preserved until the ark takes off is a whole nother can of worms, and in Noah's time, can openers hadn't yet been invented. Next, let's talk about water. All of our terrestrial animals would need 189 trillion liters of drinking water, but that's only a fraction of the total water we need on board for all the marine animals. Marine life forms require at least 100 gallons of water to exist per pound of their weight. I don't really think that Petco got that memo when they put their goldfish on display, but Noah will do better. So how much water does Noah need? Well, the smallest marine mammal known to science is presently believed to be a Mixobolus shekel, which is a parasitic jellyfish that only reaches a length of approximately 8.5 micrometers and weighs only 10 micrograms. They would need only the tiniest dribble of water. But the largest marine animal ever is, of course, the blue whale, which weighs an average of 97,500 kilograms. The amount of water that Noah would need just for the 150 blue whales that we're bringing aboard is 12 billion liters. For our average marine specimen, however, we will use a bass, one of whom is about 5 kilograms. And this bass is wearing a lovely tuxedo. Just kidding, of course, it's wearing a sheep costume. So, for all of our fishy and photoplankton-y friends to live in, Noah will need about 48 trillion liters of water. That sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's only about 5% of the total volume of water of Lake Erie. So in my opinion, it's completely doable for Noah and co to load it on board. As for the food that all of our marine friends will need, it's estimated an average bass eats about 5% of its body weight in food per day. So we will need 2 trillion pounds of fish flakes for all of our friends. And if they don't want to eat fish flakes, that's just too bad. They can just die. After all, 99% of all these animals are going to have to go extinct eventually, whether they want to or not. So, while all of that summarizes how much food and water we need for our billions of animals on board, it's not everything that's required for our animals to survive. Animals need countless other things besides simply food and water to remain alive and healthy, especially over a year-long journey, and many of these would be very easy to overlook and forget about. Billions of containers and pens need to be designed and engineered to fit the unique needs of each individual species. Systems need to be designed that provide adequate amounts of food and water to each according to their needs. Not to mention sewage systems. Cages that contain our various horned critters need to have their bars properly spaced apart to prevent their horns from getting stuck inside. Perches in the various bird cages need to be the appropriate diameter for each individual bird's foot to be able to rest on. Floors that are too hard may damage certain animals' hooves, while floors that are too soft may damage other animals' ankles. And of course, none of their setups would be complete without dual monitors and light-up mechanical keyboards. As Dr. Heinz Hediger of Zurich Zoo summarized it, animals require 1,001 small, seemingly insignificant attentions. It's hard to exactly quantify 1,001 attentions, but we'll just say that it'll add an extra kilogram per animal. Now, speaking of their setups, how much space does each animal get? We won't make the animals sleep like bats. Except for, well, the bats, because unlike the staff, we actually care if the animals make it through the trip. An average sheep is supposed to get about 1.4 square meters of floor space and about 2 meters of headspace. We decided to be generous and round up and say that each animal will get 3 cubic meters each. This means that the animals will take up about 814 billion cubic meters of space, including the 244 billion cubic meters of water that the marine life is taking up. And we haven't even touched on all the seeds and spores and snippings and petri dishes from our non-animal friends yet. For simplicity, we'll just say that Noah keeps all the 100 trillion, give or take 3, bacteria, archaea, protists, and other microscopic critters in petri dishes with agar-gel. This is doubtfully a suitable home for the vast majority of these tiny creatures, but Noah isn't even aware that any of these unicellular organisms exist, much less how to keep them alive. And honestly, I'm not much better educated than Noah was when it comes to microbiology. My best guess is that each of these microbes is taken care of approximately like a teeny tiny sheep. But I can tell you that all these petri dishes will weigh about 3 trillion kilograms and take up about 1.3 billion cubic meters of space. And we of course need to bring packets containing spores and seeds from the rest of the eukaryotic life forms. Assuming the average of seeds, spores, cuttings, and protists weighs about as much as a sunflower seed, we can assume that this will add only about 31 million kilograms. Only an extra grain of sand in the grand scheme of things. Okay, so before we tally up the total weight of the Ark, let's figure out how much space it will need to encompass. For all the animal enclosures, petri dishes, water, and staff sleeping quarters, we would need just over 1 trillion cubic meters of space. But to accommodate for storage, hallways, sewage, and miscellaneous space, let's add another 30% to that volume, giving us a grand total of 1.3 trillion cubic meters. That's about 1.25 million Empire State Buildings worth of volume. So we could probably just add the weight of all those Empire State Buildings to the weight of our Ark for a rough estimate of how much the actual walls, floors, and enclosures are all going away. The grand total of the weight of the Ark will, therefore, be 778 trillion kilograms. And that is 10 times the weight of Earth's contemporary biomass. Now obviously, collecting all of these critters and all of the resources to keep them alive would take an eternity for just one man to do. Every continent in the world, including Antarctica, contains indigenous species, and so do thousands of islands scattered across all of the world's oceans. Collecting 150 examples of every species in the world would involve not only traveling to every single corner that the world has to offer, but also struggling to locate, sedate, and capture every individual animal. For reference, during the filming of the original Planet Earth, it took the crew 16 full weeks just to simply spot and film a snow leopard in the remote Himalayas. But luckily for us, we have something that the crew of Planet Earth didn't have. We have 6.1 billion people to collect animals for us. That's enough people that they'd probably be able to do all of this capturing in, like, a year. Anyway, now that we have a good idea of how much cargo we're going to need to take with us, we already know that a wooden ship just isn't gonna cut it. The dimensions of the ship that God gave Noah was approximately 134 by 22 by 13 meters. If the entirety of that interior was dedicated for animal habitats, each animal on the Ark would have 300 cubic millimeters worth of room. And I have heard that moose take up more than 300 cubic millimeters of space. So Noah is going to have to upgrade his Ark. However, wooden ships have a maximum upper limit to their size, of around 100 meters in length before they begin to sag and sink. This is the primary reason why navies across the world began to switch to using iron and steel in the later half of the 19th century. The materials are stronger, more rigid, and allow for greater sizes and masses of ocean-going vessels to be created. But even a ship made out of steel would probably still not be enough for our purposes. Modern metal ships still succumb to the waves of the ocean, with an average of around 2,000 ships still sinking beneath the waves every year, and those are under normal oceanic circumstances, and not the unprecedented tumult of the Great Flood. If the ship sinks, then all life dies. Therefore, the best thing that we can do is to not build a ship for the sea, but a ship for space. However, a spaceship obviously adds further complexities to our problem. First and foremost would be getting the ship into space in the first place. So far, the largest object that humanity has ever blasted off into space was the Saturn V rocket during the Apollo program. That rocket was roughly the size of a 36-story building and weighed 2.8 million kilograms, with a capacity to carry only 140,000 kilograms of payload into low Earth orbit, or LEO. Our Ark, however, weighs in at over 5.5 billion Saturn Vs. So we've got to think a lot bigger here. The contemporary space shuttle program developed by NASA utilizes a twin rocket booster system to propel the shuttle into LEO. This system is able to provide 5.3 million pounds of thrust, which wouldn't even push a fraction of the Ark up. If Noah and co. are able to develop modern rocket science and thrusters equivalent in power to the Space Shuttle twin booster system, they will need 687 million of these systems underneath the Ark in order to blast it and the extra weight of the thrusters and their fuel off into low Earth orbit. However, acquiring and building 687 million rocket thrusters, engines, and acquiring all of that fuel required to power them would be a massively challenging undertaking, especially for a society that doesn't even have running water. Thankfully, though, Noah does have a significantly more efficient option that he could use. Noah could simply nuke the Ark into space. And lucky for Noah, NASA has developed a plan for such a nuclear explosion-powered thruster codenamed Project Orion. A single Orion thruster is capable of transporting 6,100 tons of payload into LEO, or over 43 times the amount of payload that the Saturn V was capable of carrying. Each thruster only comes at the cost of detonating 800 small 0.35 kiloton nuclear bombs, with a combined yield of 280 kilotons to do it, approximately the same explosive power and radiation as 18 Hiroshima events. Now, if Noah switches to nuclear science and develops the atomic bomb, he will only need approximately 140.7 million Orion-class nuclear thrusters to propel the Ark into LEO, using around 112.5 billion small nuclear bombs as fuel. With this system, the combined weight of the entire Ark with all the thrusters and bombs equipped would be several hundreds of billions of tons less weight than with chemical power and the obvious better choice. However, detonating all of these nukes to propel the Ark into LEO would be well over 39 million megatons of incomprehensibly raw explosive power. For reference, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs was the equivalent of 100 million megatons. So this blast-off will be nearly 40% of the dinosaur-annihilating and apocalypse-inducing impact. Not only would the Ark's blastoff be enough to trigger a global mass extinction in its own right, but the amount of radiation that each individual nuclear blast would give off would be enough to kill 10 people, or a total of over 1 trillion people when all the blasts are combined together. Now, while this would be wildly unethical today, for Noah, this doesn't really matter that much since everything on the surface is already getting wiped out by the Great Flood. When the apocalypse is already happening, why not generate another apocalypse to get out of it? There is, though, about 35 million tons of uranium hiding around the Earth. So, to power all of these thrusters, Noah would only need to mine about 26% of all of Earth's uranium, which is exceptionally doable. Now, after blastoff, the nuclear-powered Ark hangs out in low Earth orbit while the flood rages down below, and everyone has a jolly old time and hopefully no more than 99% of all the passengers die. We estimate that over 1 billion passengers will keel over simply due to the awful smell aboard the Ark. Like we said, Noah's society has yet to develop running water or workplace safety standards, so their version of plumbing would simply be workers hauling manure into the vacuum of space by hand and chucking it out. We think at least 2 or 3 critters will make it back down to Earth to repopulate the surface in enough time for the BBC to make some nature documentaries about them. Now, we finally need to address the elephant in the room, the staff. Obviously, they were all technically supposed to have been wiped out in the Great Flood because, according to Enlil, they were being too noisy. Noah and his family will get to survive, of course, plus about 150 other humans to deepen the gene pool and to make sure all of humanity's parasites persist. The rest, after planting all the seeds and spores and shepherding all the animals back to their proper biomes, will simply have to reboard the spaceship, blast back off, and go anywhere that isn't Earth. Hopefully, they save some Soylent. And also some nukes to launch the Ark back up into space. And hopefully Noah spent those 371 days in space stitching some radiation suits. And hopefully the animals save some food while all of the Earth's vegetation regrows. But, like I said before, 99% of all the passengers are going to have to go extinct sooner or later.